Svalbard, in the midst of the midnight sun period, was an eerie, hazy blue during the day. But Ares had been dropped in at a little past 1 a.m., hoping to get the drop on whoever had taken over the seed vault. Like most other beautiful, altruistic things in the world that had any sort of use, Umbral had forced the Norwegian government to sell the vault to them. They kept up appearances that the vault was still only being used for global seed storage. But anybody with any insight on how companies, like Umbral, worked knew that there was something more going on beneath the permafrost. Umbral never did anything without profit. The seed vault had gone dark 12 hours before, and had it been located anywhere else in the populated world, Ares would have been on site much, much quicker. But getting to Svalbard was a little different, and the loss of time had them a little on edge. Satellite imagery had revealed nothing, but they hadn't taken any chances, and were dropped nearly 2 miles away from the entrance. An easy hike by any other standards, but the snow and the weather were not on their side. It was so ungodly cold, so unbearable, that Tempest muted her comms so that the others couldn't hear her teeth chatter. She couldn't keep her eyes from the horizon either. Ribbons of blue and green twisted there, like the murmurations of starlings she would watch outside her hospital window as a child. Back then, exhausted and half dead, she sometimes imagined being carried away on those avian rivers in the sky. She hadn't thought about that in a long time, and it caused something to pang in her chest. Tempest ignored it. She wasn't a nostalgic woman, or that sick child anymore. She was a super soldier, or at least that's what she told herself in the mirror every morning. Technically, she couldn't feel the chill of the snow that reached above her ankles. Not through her boots and the bodysuit she wore under her gear, which was run through with microscopic wiring that kept her temperature stable. But damn, the cold was so intense that it found its way through supposedly non-existent cracks in her clothing, skittering over her bare flesh in painful, icy blades. Tempest was warm, considering the fact that it was -10 degrees Fahrenheit outside. But she sure as hell didn't feel warm. In the distance, the blue and green rectangular piece of artwork at the top of the entrance to the vault glowed, getting brighter and brighter as they approached. Tempest could see the light of it on the dark snow, mirroring the same colors in the sky above them. Had there been any wonder left in her, it might have felt magical. Instead, it was just a distraction she had to endure before work began. They trudged through the snowfall, 2 by 2, with Sentinel at the lead, as always. Usually Raptor brought up the rear, but after a few moments of acting a little too brash for Sentinel's comfort, he had attached the second-in-command to her. This shifted Hawkeye to the back with Jester, but the team was trained to roll effortlessly with any such changes. It still made her feel like she was being babysat, but she couldn't let it bother her, not when they were minutes away from reaching the vault. Raptor, on the other hand, didn't mind. Tempest struck him as just another hot-headed upstart, too high on her own talent to think clearly all the time. He'd seen it a million times, and expected to see it a million times more during his time working with Umbral. This one, though, he thought to himself, vaguely amused, might be more trouble than the rest. Might as well take her down a notch. I can see you shivering from here, he told her, low and quiet. Maybe, when we're done, we can get you a hot cocoa. Fuck you, she responded, just like he knew she would. Umbral had given them precious little information about what they may or may not be up against, but at least the objective was simple enough. Identify who or what entity caused the blackout at Svalbard Seed Vault. If possible, bring back member of opposing entity for interrogation. Clear area thoroughly. There was always the understood addendum to collect any specimens of interest, but he wasn't sure how that would apply to their assignment that day. The on-the-record map of the vault showed just the entrance hall, a 500-foot concrete tunnel, and then 3 vaults. The map given to Ares also showed 3 identical secret vaults directly behind the first 3, which is where all the interesting stuff would be. It wasn't often they saw direct evidence of the new technology Umbral was creating for the Eclipse Initiative, but Raptor thought they might see a fair amount of it that night. He would be annoyed if it really was just a bunch of fucking seeds. There was a short bridge leading to the entrance, which they moved over silently after Jester was allowed to sweep the structure for any sort of explosive. Even though they didn't mention it to one another, most of the group had switched off their night vision during the hike up in order to see the Aurora Borealis, a small sign of the humanity that still lingered in them. But once they were at the bridge, they could all hear the barely audible zing of the night vision being activated behind everyone's visors. It was time to work. Sentinel entered the passcode Umbral had given him into the keypad outside the heavy metal door, but it immediately turned the keypad red in denial. That meant that there really had been a breach, and whoever was inside had changed the codes. The leader grunted before holding up a hand and motioning Cipher forward. The younger man worked at prying the keypad off the wall just enough to run wires from his wrist computer interface. He could see the information on the display inside his customized visor, and while the wind whipped around the Silent 7, he broke the security in minutes. For being one of the most secure locations on Earth, the Seed Vault was surprisingly minimalistic inside. Most of the structure was gray concrete and silvery metal, exposed pipes and wiring giving off the distinct air that it was not a place built for appearances, but functionality only. Raptor appreciated that there wasn't a lot of nonsense to occupy their time searching, but the high ceiling and sterilized air of the vault's entry also gave them very few places to hide, if necessary. What's more, they couldn't even utilize one of their best assets, Hawkeye, in the vault to his fullest extent. He had found it stupid that the sniper disembarked the chopper with his enormous rifle still strapped to his back, but he knew better than to question another soldier's quirks or choices. Hawkeye was more likely to just shrug instead of answer anyway. Their footsteps, normally silent, gave off a dull echo on the corrugated metal floor. Built right into the mountain, the ceiling and surrounding walls were roughly hewn sandstone, and sound carried oddly. Ares wasn't sure what they were going to run into, but one thing was for certain: they weren't alone, even if it felt like they were. The other challenge was, even inside, the cold. Frost, inches thick in some places, covered almost all of the piping and ductwork, displaying just how frigid it was even inside. They were all dressed in the warming bodysuits, so none of their movements were restricted by the chill, but it still wasn't a good time. Ares cleared the entrance hall with quick, meticulous movements. Curiously, they found no signs of any intrusion, so, with a few more quick hand signals, Sentinel had them moving into the transport tunnel. It was a nightmare as far as both offense and defense went, just large enough for 2 people to walk side by side. They shifted into walking single file, dark shadows in the harsh overhead light. They spend the almost 500-foot walk adjusting their gear and readying for the unknown challenge, always on high alert. With no idea what lies in the back 3 vaults, Ares couldn't even work out who might want to take over the vault. Knowing Umbral, it could be anything ranging from bioweapons to cloning technology. The fact of the matter was, it didn't matter what was there in the back. Raptor couldn't have an opinion on ethics or morality about anything anymore. They had been trained to see anything and everything, but it was difficult when they had to move in such a small space, each soldier offset from the one in front of and behind them. It was Sentinel who first saw the warning, so obscure that anyone else might have missed it. The thin sheen of frost on the grated floor was undisturbed and flawless ahead of them, except for 2 large ovals of bare, unfrozen floor right next to one another. They were about 10 feet from the ovals and only 12 from the vault entrance when Sentinel held up a fist to halt them. But before he could make the call about how to proceed, all hell broke loose. The leader only had time to see the air above what he knew were footprints, shimmering, before the shots began to fly from the nothingness. Everyone hit the floor, going low before pressing against the walls and making themselves as difficult to pinpoint as possible. Ares fired back, but it was impossible to see their assailant. It was almost painfully loud in the small tunnel, but it was 7-1, and it was only seconds before one of Team Ares' bullets hit home and caused the invisible foe to grunt and flicker into sight. It only lasted for a breath, but now that they had seen the enemy, the team was able to zero in and attack in full. They could hear, and when the bullets hit, see the invisible man as he fled into the vault and disappeared to the left. There was a blood trail, much smaller than it should be, leading the way too, but Ares took a moment to reconvene before following it inside.
It's some sort of advanced optic camo,
Cipher told them.
Since it wasn't damaged, only momentarily disrupted by shots, I think it must be run by some sort of passive energy field that is centralized somewhere nearby. They take that out, and they will be visible. They can't go in blind,
Aegis protested.
We don't even know what we're looking for, or how many are out there. I've got this,
Jester announced.
Sentinel, permission to take lead? Granted.
The leader steps aside and allows the demolition expert to take point.
How much time do you need to prepare? I don't need any.
They saw his crooked smirk before he pulled his gas mask on.
Go ahead and mask up. Cipher, behind me.
Faces covered, Jester moved them forward, unclipping 2 round grenades from the vest of his uniform. When they were close enough, he pulled the tabs and threw one left and one right. The pops from the explosives are muted, but as soon as they are heard, thick, viscous smoke begins to fill the enormous concrete vault. It wasn't like any other smoke grenade, and the dark gray clouds expanded rapidly, growing to almost impossible sizes. With the map of the center vault on his visor display, Cipher directed them verbally, and Jester followed his directions instantly. Putting their trust in the 2 leads, Ares didn't split up to quickly clear the room, but kept a tight, deadly formation as they pressured the invisible adversaries, driving them to the center of the room. The entire place was cut into thin walkways between towering shelves of seeds, all sealed in airtight containers, and it should have been impossible for them to maneuver. But Ares wasn't one of the top teams in the Eclipse Initiative for nothing. Whatever optic camouflage was being used, Cipher quickly ascertained that it was using some sort of mirror technology. The enemy soldiers weren't clear silhouettes in the smoke like they would have been if their camouflage was an AI-generated cover. Instead, they were rendered into pixelated, misplaced gray forms. Not easy to see, but visible. It was instantly clear that they were wearing some sort of impenetrable body armor, just like Ares was. But Jester hadn't taken point just to let off his modified smoke grenades. As soon as the first ghostly figure came into view, Jester lifted his AA-12 shotgun and fired. Of the 3 possible forms of ammunition he had on his belt, he had chosen birdshot. It wasn't deadly, but when he fired and the figure hissed and grabbed at the bend of his knee, the vulnerabilities of their armor became clear, and as soon as the vulnerabilities were pinpointed, Jester's team members fired their rifles and hit the weak spots without a single word needing to be exchanged. As soon as the invisible soldiers dropped their weapons after being hit, the weapons became visible, and Ares kicked them out of reach as they went. With the perfect system worked out, the team moved through the center vault, nearly blind but no less effective. Adrenaline and pure, clean joy coursed through Jester as they moved. The flawlessness of the way they flowed made him want to laugh out loud. Cipher called,
Left.
or
Right.
and Jester would turn. He would then spot the pixelated anomaly in the heavy smog, raise his shotgun, and fire before the blinded, sometimes coughing enemy could see them and react. Like clockwork, they would cry out, or stay silent, but all of them grabbed at a place on their bodies where one of his hundreds of pellets dug into them. As soon as they did, the rest of the team fired, and the enemy went down. Some were hit in the knee, others in the elbow, and a few of the more unfortunate ones were hit right in the throat. There were 6 enemy soldiers in total, and no one had any illusions that Ares wasn't vastly outmanned. If there were 6 in the center vault, there were surely more elsewhere. The Svalbard seed vault had a constantly cycling ventilation system, and the smoke started to clear soon enough. Cipher moved them around the perimeter, through the outer racks, and inward, making a spiral. So, when they reached the center, Team Ares could almost see clearly, and they were the last ones standing. Directly in the center, at their feet, was a downed, still camouflaged person. Around them, there were moans and the sound of the other downed soldiers trying to move. While elbows and knees weren't exactly kill points, 5 or more projectiles embedded in each would put even the toughest mercenary down. The one at their feet had been taken out at the knees, and as the air became clearer and clearer, all that was left of the man that was easily visible were the pools of blood beneath him and the shimmer of his camouflage. Sentinel looked to Tempest and gave her a tight nod. She grabbed the down man by the neck, hauling him up, even when he buckled on his decimated knees, and slammed the invisible figure against one of the racks. He flickered, visible and then gone again, too quick for them to see anything but his oddly slate-gray uniform. Tempest held the man there, digging her knee into his shattered one. No one moved as the sounds of pain from the other downed soldiers were drowned out by the grinding of bone on bone. Her prisoner screamed.
Now, where is the control center for the camouflage?
She growled, voice distorted by her mask. The man in her grip wheezed. Tempest leaned back and brought her booted foot up, driving it into his left knee so hard that it bent nearly backwards. He howled. "Ventilation pipe in the entry hall!" The words were wrenched from his throat as if Tempest pulled them out of him with her bare hands. She dropped him and dusted her hands off, everyone waiting for their next orders.
Hawkeye, take Cipher and find it.
Sentinel commanded.
Everyone else, eliminate any fallen. Once the camouflage is down, we're going to need to finish clearing the 2 remaining forward vaults and then tackle the back 3.
The group echoed acknowledgements and moved into action. Aegis didn't know if executing humans that she couldn't see was better or worse than the ones she had to look in the eye. It didn't hurt the tattered bits of her soul quite as badly, knowing that these people would have killed her had they been given the chance. But it was still dirty, distasteful work. Having to use both hands to feel for their heads, dig her gloved fingers under an invisible helmet while they were weakly trying to fight her off, and then finally sink a bullet into their temples with her sidearm, had her stomach turning. But Aegis gritted her teeth and did it. Lucky for her, the math worked out and she only had to execute 1 man. Cipher and Hawkeye retraced their steps, and by the time they returned, the rest of the group was waiting for them. Minutes earlier, they had watched as the passive energy field controlling the camouflage powered down, and the invisible corpses became visible to them for the first time. As a whole team, they investigated the bodies and the strange, chitinous gray body armor they wore. They each wore a receiver on their backs, the size of a matchbook, that powered the camo when the passive field was active. Other than the armor and the camo, though, they looked like any other run-of-the-mill mercenary group that Ares had run into before. Seeing that they were just normal humans relaxed the team somewhat, and they all stretched, reloaded their weapons, and readied themselves for the next forward vault. Only the center vault held the seeds that the vault was named for. According to public information, the vaults to the left and right were empty and used for nothing but storage, awaiting the day that they would also be needed to hold the keys to future plant growth. They were also left mostly blank on the map that Umbral had provided the Eclipse Initiative with, reading only Armory. And they were indeed armories. Some of the most well-stocked ones that Aegis had ever seen, with weapons both familiar and completely foreign to the medic stacked nearly to the ceiling. Both side vaults contained, just like the center vault, 6 enemy soldiers each. They had tightened their patrols and were much more quick on the trigger now that their camouflage was gone, but Ares was unbothered by this. In the full light, head on, there were very few in the world who would be a challenge for them. This group was not one of them. In line with their objectives, Aegis took a single soldier out with a non-lethal round, putting the poor young woman to sleep with a morphine injection to the neck once she was down. Umbral would want a hostage to extract information from once they were back at base, especially since no amount of field interrogation methods would get them to give up any names besides Armor. According to one terrified mercenary, it stood for Advanced Recon and Military Operations Regiment. It started to cause a frisson of concern to work its way down Aegis's spine. These mercenaries struck her as one thing, and one thing only: rookies. But not rookies like Tempest or Cipher, young and hot-headed but ultimately effective, but scared, hardly trained rookies. All of them were awful shots, their bullets either missing or hitting the Ares members in places visibly protected by body armor. They didn't seem to know why their own group, Armor, had been tasked with taking over the seed vault either. Something was off. She was sure of it. With 17 dead and 1 incapacitated, Ares finished clearing the front 3 vaults and still had no idea what the takeover was about. While Cipher once again moved forward to coax the hidden door leading to the back vaults open, Aegis slid up next to Raptor and flipped her comms off. She wanted this to be a private conversation. There was a certain rapport between the two, and all she had to say was,
"What do you think?"
for him to catch her drift. Like usual, they were on the same page. The battle-hardened Kenyan, second in command, and the German field medic made an odd duo, but on the battlefield, stranger friendships than theirs had been forged.
I think it's a trap.
Raptor told her, his voice low.
And if I'm thinking it, Sentinel is thinking it too. So, why are we going forward? Like it's just going to be 18 more greenhorns on the other side of this door. Realistically, we have no idea.
He shrugged one massive shoulder.
As far as I see it, the boss probably figures that if we are obviously aware of whatever game is being played, our adversary back there will be more likely to try to eliminate us with brute force as soon as possible. But if they think we still think we've already won, they'll underestimate us and we'll have the upper hand. The element of surprise and all that.
Aegis hummed to herself thoughtfully, but her teammates' words did little to settle her.
All right, if you say so.
When the keypad in front of Cipher went green, the group raised their rifles and moved, making their way into the first of the secret vaults and towards whatever mysteries they held. Sentinel visualized the seed vault's layout in his mind and was less than thrilled with what he was leading his team into. The back three vaults had the fantastically vague designations of battery for the center, research and development for the right, and for the left, simply the three-pronged warning sign for radiation. Great. Every member of the Eclipse Initiative had been given an experimental humanized anti-radiation vaccine, but he still wasn't keen on dragging his crew into some radioactive underground bunker. He hoped that whoever or whatever was in the back vaults was more of the same from the front ones, just an upstart group of mercenaries that got lucky breaking into the seed vault, only to find out that they had bit off more than they could chew. That hope was in vain, even if he didn't know it yet. It was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the always active ventilation system breaking the silence at all. Just like the name suggested, the battery was full of artillery, and everything was illuminated by obnoxiously bright overhead LEDs. He moved Ares through the vault as silently as possible, crouched low, and weapons drawn. But it appeared as if the place was empty, which was impossible. Someone with experience had broken into the vault, and there were only 2 more places they could possibly be. It set his teeth on edge. Ares finished clearing the entire battery vault and found no one. It was becoming obvious to most of them that there was some sort of ambush waiting on them, but there was nothing else to be done besides push on. The choice of the next room to examine was easy: research and development. The hulking, thick steel door of the radiation vault was unwelcoming, and Ares had no desire to push their luck if they didn't have to. There was an airlock between the back center vault and the R&D vault, and once they entered the lock, they could see the R&D lab through a small porthole window. The walls and ceiling weren't the rough sandstone of the others, but inside were white and sterile. It was a familiar sight for all of them, but the sheer amount of work it must have taken to assemble the lab deep in the mountain wasn't lost on the team. Whatever was being created there had to be important, at least to Umbral. They could also see that they weren't alone. The rest of the group that had broken into the seed vault was posted inside, seemingly unbothered that they were all fully visible at that point. Or maybe they hadn't felt the need to use the same camo as the earlier crew, because any obvious signs that the first round of mercenaries had been new to the game weren't present anywhere in this smaller team. Dressed in the same chitinous silver-gray armor, the similarities ended there. Sentinel could see 8 of them, and it was difficult for him to tell them apart. The 4 without helmets had shaved heads in differing lengths of regrowth, but all of their hair short enough that he could see the flesh of their skulls underneath. Those almost bare heads displayed, unhindered, the segments of mechanical, transdermal spine implants going from the back of the heads and disappearing beneath their uniforms. All of them were armed to the teeth, and all of them were well aware that Ares was a door away. Rifles were raised, scopes in front of eyes, and the mercenaries were unnaturally still.
Leave none standing,
Sentinel told his team.
HEI protocol. Modified single breach point.
He hit the button, and the door slid open with a hiss. Ares' hostile environment infiltration protocol was simple and deadly, but made more dangerous by the fact that there was only one possible entrance. So, Hawkeye, Jester, and Tempest fell back into the center vault and out of the airlock, while the other 4 pushed forward and fanned out. There was no waiting, and the firefight came to life in an instant. Sentinel, Raptor, Cipher, and Aegis took cover where they could, but didn't push the armor soldiers back any. They centered precise, calculated shots where they had learned their vulnerabilities might lay, letting the opposing team move forward on them inch by inch. When the enemy team was close to bearing down on the 4 Ares members, the shots echoed off the lab walls so powerfully that no one heard the snick of the grenade pin being pulled from right beyond the airlock. But they noticed when one, and then a second, of the viscous gas grenades landed and exploded. All of Ares were still wearing their gas masks, and although they were equally blinded by the fog, it didn't burn at their ears, noses, and mouths like it did for the other mercenaries. With the upper hand obtained, they advanced. There were a few short minutes where vision was almost impossible, and Tempest slid into the haze like a shadow. She had memorized which of the armor team were helmetless, and found the first of them in the darkness, bringing them down with a few devastating blows before drawing her combat blade across their exposed throats. Except, the knife barely parted the flesh. She frowned, but didn't miss a beat, increasing the pressure until she got the result she wanted. It all happened in a flash before she dropped the body and moved towards the next, blood hot on her hands, but something stopped her. A hand around her ankle. From the body. The body with the slit throat. She kicked out with her free foot, catching the soldier in the head and making his hand release, but she was shaken nonetheless. Who the hell survives their throat being slit? Tempest thought furiously, already grappling with her next opponent. It should have been easy to find room to move in the massive vault, but the smoke and the unexpected durability of the armor team was throwing Ares off. Cipher, for all that the team considered him their computer geek, was a crack shot most of the time. Deep in that mountain, though, he felt like no single shot was shaking the bastards. He could see Raptor finally hit one in the throat and make them throw their heads back, and Cipher was sure his second-in-command had gotten the second kill behind Tempest. But the armor soldier's chin came back down to his chest, and Cipher watched, disbelieving, as the man raised his rifle and continued the assault.
Did anyone else see that?
Raptor growled over comms. In unison, a few of them answered in the affirmative.
Hawkeye,
Sentinel's voice came through calm and clear.
fall back and get into position. Go for the head. See if you can break through the helmets. We need the instant kill, if you can manage it.
While the sniper took a knee after getting as much distance as possible, the rest of the team continued to spin their wheels. The ventilation cleared the air, and Cipher could see Tempest locked in hand-to-hand combat with one of the armor members. A wave of cold hit him when he saw the muscles of her legs quivering to hold herself in place as the woman she was fighting tried to pull her to the ground. Tempest was strong, almost obscenely so. And if she was struggling, it worried him. The tide turned when Tempest's opponent finally managed to get her off balance and deliver a devastating kick to Tempest's gut, sending her flying as if she weighed nothing. The distance should have been impossible, and they all heard the breath leave Tempest's lungs as she hit the floor hard.
Cover her!
Raptor snapped, and Ares reformed, giving up hard-earned ground to circle their fallen member as she struggled to her feet. There was a wheeze to her breathing, but she was conscious. As his vision cleared, Cipher heard the telltale, bone-deep crack of Hawkeye firing. He aimed for the woman who had been Tempest's adversary in her uncovered head, but with a movement that should have been impossible, she raised her arms in an X in front of her face at the crack of the arm, and Hawkeye's round took her in the forearm. By all accounts, the .338 Lupa Magnum round should have cut through both of her arms like butter and reached her skull, especially at such a close distance. But while she cried out, it wasn't a kill. The soldier dropped her arms and Cipher got a good look at her one crippled arm and the red hole in it. But to everyone's shock, the round was simply embedded halfway in her other arm, where they had been crossed. So either the body armor was impossibly durable, or the soldiers themselves were. Or both. All Hawkeye had to say about the matter was a deadpan,
Huh.
before he was clearing the round from his rifle and firing again. He got the clean between the eyes hit that he had been seeking, and the soldier dropped slowly. First going to her knees, then to her hands, and finally the ground, rolling herself onto her back before collapsing in full, open eyes staring skyward. She should have been dead on impact, but a kill was a kill, even if somehow the round was still inside her skull instead of embedded in the lab wall. Not the body armor then, the opposing soldiers themselves. Cipher could feel the thread of familiarity in his mind vibrating, so with a quick request for cover, he moved back behind Sentinel and activated his optical display, zooming in on the downed soldier's face and examining where the bullet had sunk in. There was the expected gore, but it was different. The shot had cracked her skin like it was glass, hairline fractures running away from the jagged hole in her skull, not at random, but following hexagonal lines, a perfect pattern. He was momentarily stunned. None of the information that he had skimmed off the private Umbral servers mentioned anything like cybernetic skin. But there it was, right in front of him. The urge to dive as deep as possible into research itched at him, but with the cracks and booms of guns firing around him, he had more pressing matters to attend to. There was also the issue of what the Seed Vault lab was really working on. But unless he had to, he wasn't going to reveal what he knew. Cipher was already flying too close to the sun, but Ares was currently incredibly close to one of Umbral's top projects. He hadn't meant to come across the information while researching Project Chimera, but it was too late. It wasn't possible to scrub the truth from his mind. With nothing else to do, Cipher tried not to think about how he had been sneaking into the Umbral servers, tried not to think about what any of the armor soldiers might have already acquired, and simply did his job.
They're enhanced.
He told the team.
It is in their skin, not the clothing.
The rest of the team absorbed this information. Cipher rejoined the ranks, and Ares, like they always did, adjusted. Now that they knew what they were looking for, the offensive took a different turn. Jester could feel the sweat dripping down his neck beneath his gear, and he was losing humor with the situation with each passing moment. His hands were tingling from the constant vibrations of the shots he was firing, and his jaw was tight. The firefight was taking far too fucking long for Jester's taste. The death of the second armor soldier had their squad mates kicking the aggression up, one of them shooting into the glass window of the airlock and shattering it. The distraction didn't faze Ares, but the message was clear. We're coming through. Hawkeye downed the last two without helmets, and Ares finally outnumbered armor, 4-7. Jester ducked behind a lab station, the same one where Tempest was catching her breath, and looked over at her.
You good? Broken ribs, probably.
She gritted out.
Don't tell Aegis.
Jester chuckled. He didn't want to tell her that Aegis had probably diagnosed her immediately just from her breathing pattern or something similar. The lab was destroyed beyond recognition, and he knew good and well that unless they managed to salvage something from this bullshit mess, Umbral was going to be pissed. Their objectives were to bring a single live subject back for interrogation, if possible. But that was before they all knew that armor were some sort of cyber soldiers. Umbral would definitely want as many samples of something like that as possible. So Sentinel had made a split-second call and yelled out in his booming voice,
"Surrender, and we'll take you in alive."
He might as well have been talking to the wall. For whatever damned reason, Armor was trying to push up on them as closely as possible, like they wanted to engage in hand-to-hand. It made no sense to the demolitions expert, but he had his eye on someone else. And from Cipher's reaction to the enemy's increasing closeness, there was something dangerous afoot. He knew the little shit had been dipping his fingers into Umbral's private digital cookie jar here and there. And while he was a dead man walking if he got caught, Jester didn't mind benefiting from it temporarily. He had caught on that something weird was going on with the Chimera mission, from Cipher's fidgetiness. And now, by the way the rookie was fighting like it was his last stand, Jester would bet that he was afraid of something. Something that made him desperate to stop the last 4 mercenaries getting any closer. Jester glanced at Tempest out of the corner of his eye.
Are you coming back in?
The woman nodded after checking her SMG.
Good.
He sighed.
I think this is about to become an all-hands-on-deck situation.
It had been a long, long time since he had been hit, so when the bullet caught him in the chest, blessedly deflected by his protective vest, Jester felt the first real shiver of apprehension. They were all getting tired, and while the armor soldiers died well enough, fatigue didn't seem to be an issue. They pressed and pressed and pressed, until Hawkeye, with a quiet curse, had to switch to his sidearm once more. Once armor was 12 or so feet from Ares, Cipher cracked.
I think I know what they were after in this lab,
he announced, tone thin.
I can't say for sure, but I have feelings that last vault is empty. I think they already have what they came for. What the hell are you talking about?
Raptor demanded.
Okay, see those cases they've got strapped to their legs? About foot long, solid black. It's a lead-lined carrying case. Umbral has been working on fast-acting radioactive assassination tool.
The words came out of the hacker in short bursts as he continued to keep pace with the rest of his team.
Polonium-210, in jet-infected format.
Cipher ducked behind a counter to reload.
Casings are also lead-lined, about size of marca, with single-loaded dose that can be administered by press of a button. Nearly instant, silent death from acute radiation sickness.
It couldn't really be called a silence, what with everything going on around them. But there was an unnerving wave of quiet that passed through the team, even as they continued to work like 7 ever-grinding gears. Cipher lied through his teeth.
There was mention of it in some of data I pulled at Havoc Lab. Just footnote, but it fits. It all fits. Damn it.
Sentinel gritted out after 10 long seconds.
And you just put this together? It isn't really a conductive environment for deep thinking, sir.
Cipher replied.
Fine. We've got to get some distance then. Fall back to the center vault.
You idiot, Jester thought as they slowly started to pull in back. Cipher, you absolute moron. It wasn't the worst situation he had ever been in, but it was the first time Raptor sensed any fraying at the bonds that connected Ares into a single unit. He heard the glass crunching under his boots as they got closer to the airlock. Raptor was to wait until he was fully inside to turn and lead the team into the center vault. If his guess was correct, he was about 1.5 minutes from beginning that maneuver, which would shift his role from rear guard to point. Sentinel would become rear guard on the other end of the line as they all turned one by one. They had done it, without exaggeration, hundreds of times before. He wasn't concerned. Raptor wasn't afraid. Not for himself or his team. Hell, he wasn't sure that he even felt fear like other people did at that point in his life. Then, without a word exchanged, Armor clicked their rifles into their belts, slid identical reverse grip blades from wrist sheaths and into their hands, and charged. Raptor was in the airlock and had just turned, so he didn't see the assault at first. Cipher directly behind him had almost made the pivot, which made it even harder for Raptor to figure out what was going on. Sentinel called,
"Front!"
but the damn airlock was so tight. The 5 Ares members still outside of the lock were already firing, but they were forced to switch to close quarters tactics in a rush. Tempest was still injured, and there was a good chance their assailants had a device that could put each and every one of them down in an instant. They had to get some space. Behind him was a press of fighting bodies, so Raptor turned just enough to grab Cipher and hauled him out of the airlock and into the open of the center vault. They would either head right back inside, prepared, or the rest of the team would follow them out. His jaw was clenched so hard, Raptor thought his teeth might break, helplessness welling up in him like a fever. Then they finally followed. Aegis, Hawkeye, Tempest, Jester, and last was Sentinel, howling.
"Close the damn door!"
Raptor slammed his hand on the switch, and the door swished closed, an instant before the first armor soldier made it through, hitting the closed door like a battering ram. Leveraging his weight to keep it closed, despite the inner switch being activated over and over, Raptor had to fight both the strength of the soldier trying to push the door open and the mechanism of the door itself for a few seconds before the rest of the team sprung into action. Sentinel and Jester joined him, their shoulders and body weight adding to his, and Cipher worked his magic to disable the lock electronically, fingers flying over the screen on his wrist interface. With that done, they were only fighting the armor team who were trying to wrench it open, and their enhanced strength was crystal clear. Raptor set his jaw, locked his knees, and held. Voice strained from effort, Sentinel called,
"We need a full-scale neutralization. To hell with bringing any of them back breathing. Quick and complete. What do we have?" "I've got plenty of explosives, but letting them off around all this artillery would be a mistake."
Jester grunted, fighting just as hard to keep the door from being forced open.
"So, I guess it's gotta be chemical. It's ugly, but I've got a few concentrated sarin gas charges. Not instant, but close enough if we can lock them in this vault and get the hell out of here. Issue is going to be ventilation system,"
Cipher added, already looking through the blueprints of the seed vault on his interface.
"They've got enough wireless access to kill power remotely, but ventilation system electronics are way older. It looks like control panel for it back near entrance. Problem is that if we cut all power, this place is going to freeze solid before Umbro can get anyone in here, and if that happens, it will be all of our asses. So..."
He went silent, double-checking this plan before nodding once.
"Okay, I've got it. Jester. 1 electrical charge placed precisely on outside of entry between front and back vaults should fry wiring. I've marked the area and sent it to you. I'm sure they'll be able to breach even that massive door, so you're going to have to time everything out perfectly. I'll tell you as soon as I have ventilation cut off.
Their leader didn't even hesitate.
Good. Hawkeye, go with them. Jester, as soon as they are out of this vault, go set the gas and the electrical charges. We'll hold them in place until it's done. Now move.
Exhausted, the 7 of them still functioned like a perfect dance. Hawkeye and Cipher ran towards the front of the vault, a long distance, but one that should be free of any obstacles. Meanwhile, Jester stepped away from the door just long enough for Tempest and Aegis to take his place. The demolition expert checked the schematics from Cipher on his much smaller wrist interface and got to work. Raptor had hoped to hold armor in the airlock, but the cybernetically modified team wasn't suffering from the same fatigue. The reinforced glass of the porthole window mirroring the one on the inner airlock door went first, raining shards down on the 4 Ares members. Then, the metal began to creak as it bent inward. He was sure armor was going to manage to push through. When the first one reached their arm through the shattered window, blindly reaching, he knew that trying to hold the door any longer was going to be pointless. They fell back, weapons at the ready, and began to fire as soon as the opposing 4 came through. Jester rejoined them soon enough, bringing them back to 5 against 4. He kept telling himself mentally that it shouldn't be much longer, that Cipher and Hawkeye were moving as quickly as they could. Maybe, if Tempest had been at full strength, or maybe if Jester hadn't taken so long to set the charges, they could have kept them at some sort of distance. But the towering racks of artillery and the cramped spaces between them made it impossible. And before Raptor knew it, he was fighting hand to hand with a man that had a punch like an oncoming train. His opponent still had the reverse grip knife in his hand, but Raptor wasn't overly worried about the blade. His body armor should have absorbed any slash or stab. The fights, both the one he was stuck in and the ones around him, were ugly and brutal. He pushed his gas mask up despite his better judgment, needing better vision and tasting blood in his mouth. The other man might have been armed and enhanced, but Raptor was the better fighter. There was something to the way he fought, fist to jaw and knee to kidney, that still carried echoes of the brawls he would get into as a hungry, whip-thin kid on the streets. It made him intelligent in a way that a lot of other soldiers weren't, and it made him able to take his opponent to the ground, slamming his helmeted head on the concrete floor. He let the knife edge catch him in the shoulder as he moved to draw his sidearm, but his grip stuttered when the blade unexpectedly cut through his gear and right into his flesh, sinking deep. The pain was a lightning flash that Raptor ignored, grabbing the other man's wrist and wrenching it sideways. The bone didn't crack like he expected, but he released the knife, which Raptor jerked from his shoulder with a grunt. And with his uninjured arm, he stabbed upwards until the blade slid up and under the other man's chin, parting his enhanced skin with a sound not unlike the crackle of breaking ceramic, and with one final push, up through the jaw and into the skull. Raptor jumped off the man as soon as he went limp, and took in the scene around him, ignoring the throb in his shoulder. Sentinel was engaged with one soldier, Jester was backing up Tempest with another, and Aegis was trying to take down the third. He watched the medic kick her larger opponent aside, but as the man landed heavily, Aegis wasn't able to close the distance and finish the job quickly enough. Everything happened at once. They all heard Cipher's sharp
"Now!"
from their comms. In the same moment, Raptor watched the man Aegis had been fighting jerk open the matte black box on his thigh. Raptor felt like his heart would pound out of his chest as the man yanked a single black cylinder, perfectly sized to fit in his palm, out, and held it in front of him like a talisman. Aegis skipped to a stop, but the armored soldier struck out like a viper and grabbed her around the ankle, jerking her leg out from under her and bringing her to one knee. Sentinel's voice was muffled in Raptor's ears as he yelled for them to evacuate the vault. Jester ready to blow first the door charge, and then the sarin charges when they were all free. He and Aegis were the furthest from the door. They'd never make it. Not with the last 2 armor soldiers already sprinting after the rest of Ares, and the soldier Aegis was engaged with armed with the pneumatic polonium device. He couldn't leave her. He wouldn't be able to leave any of his team, but definitely not Aegis. Fear trickled in. He could still feel it after all. Raptor yanked his gas mask back over his face and snapped it shut.
Set off the gas and close the door, but don't fry the wiring,
he yelled.
We'll be right behind you.
Their leader almost never hesitated, but there was a single heartbeat of time where Raptor saw Sentinel looking at him across the distance, right at the mouth of the vault entrance door. But Raptor was second in command, and Sentinel had given him the trust time and time again. He did it one more time, rushing Tempest and Jester out before the door slammed shut behind them. A second later, the sarin gas charges popped, and the noxious fumes began to fill the air. It wasn't ideal, but his and Aegis's masks should keep them safe long enough to rejoin the rest of the team on the other side. He ignored the 2 free enemies, hearing them start to choke. Raptor sprinted towards Aegis, more than ready to get the hell out of the vault. With his blood rushing in his ears, he could barely hear what the medic was telling him as he drew close.
No!
She shouted.
Raptor, don't!
Then the cyber soldier had Aegis under him in the struggle, and he put the hard bar of his arm across her neck, even as she bucked and kicked underneath him. Raptor saw the polonium device in his hand, saw the way he was fighting to bring it to the thrashing medic's temple, and did something brilliantly, horrendously foolish. Anything else would have taken too long. Raptor didn't waste time pulling his sidearm or even his combat knife. Aegis had only inches, only seconds until certain death, and the scraps of the good man he might have been screamed for him to act. So he did. Wrapping his arm around the armor soldier's neck, he wrenched him backwards and off of Aegis. It took all of his strength, and his grip wasn't what it should have been because of his shoulder, but it was enough, and he fell backwards with the other man in a vicious headlock, freeing his teammate. She scrambled to her feet, but it wasn't quick. Raptor felt a rush of relief at seeing her stand, though, and it was powerful enough that he barely registered the press of lead-lined steel against the back of his gloved hand around the man's neck. But he did hear the pneumatic hiss of the device injecting. Freezing, high-pressure streams of liquid cut through the glove, skin, muscle, and into bone. And it was done. They were screaming at her over the comms.
Aegis! Aegis! Cipher is down, do you copy? Aegis!
It was a cacophony of all of them, but she didn't have the breath to answer. Every ounce of air was given to the task of hauling all 200+ pounds of Raptor to the exit. The last of the armor soldiers vomited, choked, and died around them. She lowered him just enough to pound on the exit door, gasping,
It's me!
hoping they would hear her over all their yelling. The door switched open, and immediately Sentinel was there to take the burden of her second in command. Aegis stumbled out into the clean air, ripping the mask from her face as soon as the door closed behind her again. Sentinel took one look at her and held his fist up, silencing the rest of the team. Aegis knew she was probably in some sort of shock, but that didn't fucking matter. Raptor was dying, and something had happened to Cipher.
Get the helmets off,
she said, not caring who followed her directions, only that it was done.
Hawkeye, what happened?
Aegis listened, already on her knees next to Cipher as the sniper gingerly undid the unmoving man's helmet. His dark blonde hair was streaked with blood, and his eyes were open, staring. He was dead. She took his pulse anyway. All she could hear was a static buzz. All of Ares had eyes. They could see the same thing she did. The ragged bullet hole at the back of the young hacker's head, embedding inside the front of his now empty helmet. No CPR, no field medicine could undo the way his skull had been shattered, or the devastation of his gray matter. Hawkeye spoke. The female, inexperienced armor member that they had knocked out and planned to bring alive to Umbral had awoken when he and Cipher were finished and heading back. The sniper said, in his monotone voice, that there had been no movement from her at all, no way to know she was alive, until, from the ground, she raised her sidearm and sunk a single shot into the back of Cipher's head before Hawkeye could put her down in nearly the same way. It was a freak accident, such a random chance that no one could have anticipated it. A chill of grief rippled through the team as the medic moved from Cipher to Raptor, who was alive, but barely. His brown skin had taken on a gray cast, and his pupils were pinpoints. Raptor was conscious, his eyes following her every move as she tried to shut off the human part of her mind and just become the medic. Aegis worked, everything else around them fading away. There was so fucking little she could do for this, but she wasn't going to stop. Not when the dead body of one of her crewmates was laying right there, an arm's length away, and Raptor was still breathing under her flying hands. Aegis, stop, Raptor rasped. We both know how this ends. I'm done. Shut up, she hissed. It's polonium-210, he countered. He caught Vu in the hand. A messy strike too. We're vaccinated, she argued. Open your mouth. Aegis. Gideon. Aegis's teeth were clenched, and the words were forced between them. Open your goddamn mouth before I do it for you, he acquiesced, and with tiny sips of water from her belt canteen, she had him swallow potassium iodine pills, followed by Prucina blue capsules. The latter wasn't known to help with polonium, but she wasn't taking any chances. Aegis refused to think about how the ridiculously high dose would be too much for any field cure she had, and how he was only still with them because of how distant his hand was from his core. The affected extremity hung limp at his side, swollen, the beds of his fingernails blood red. Raptor could barely swallow, but they got the pills in him. Then she had nothing left to do, and sat back on her heels, watching his face and listening to the battle of his breathing. Aegis heard a calm, almost comforting, deep voice behind her. Sentinel. Tell me what to do. Send someone out. Call for extraction. If we have any chance, we've got to get him back to Umbral. Sentinel pointed to Tempest, and then to the tunnel leading out of the mountain. The rookie nodded once, and took off at a jog. Is he safe to carry? The commander asked. Aegis hesitated. Yes. For us. Since we all got humanized radiation vaccine, I believe so. It's only affecting him so badly because the injection was intraosseous. In her heart, she knew that at least Sentinel would have probably carried the poisoned man out, even if he was dangerous to the touch. But he wouldn't risk the rest of Ares unless she gave him the okay. Fuck that. Raptor's voice was almost a whisper. Leave me. It's not worth the risk. Aegis's thoughts were a jumble of self-loathing. He's suffering because he saved me. Me. All too human emotions were welling up in her, and she had the absurd fear that her team might see the fear in her eyes. So, she only looked at Raptor, I'm the medic here, and I'm making the call. He grabbed her wrist with his good hand. Her unlikely friend, her savior, held her gaze. Alitza, don't try and be a hero. Not for me. She shook her head. Cipher's death hung over them like a thundercloud. Then you shouldn't have been one back there either, Gideon. Aegis turned around to look at Sentinel, who had removed his mask too, and nodded once. Let's move out, he boomed, and the shaken, still standing members of Ares fell into position. Hawkeye and I will carry Raptor. Aegis saw the commander's jaw tighten as he gave the final order. We leave Cipher. The mission to the Svalbard seed vault was considered a success, but only by a razor-thin margin. There were no survivors from the group, armor, that had infiltrated the vault in order to collect the polonium pneumatic devices. But their corpses provided enough information for Umbral that the mega corporation was satisfied. All of Ares had to go through radiation decontamination. Once they were released, they were interrogated by the heads of the Eclipse Initiative to see if they held any extra information about the cybernetically enhanced soldiers. After that was finished, they were free to rest up and ready themselves for the next assignment whenever it came in. There were no mentions of their fallen squadmate, Cipher, besides to confirm how exactly he had died. All they knew about Raptor was that he was alive, somewhere in the depths of one of Umbral's medical facilities, and in an induced coma with the shallow hopes that he might pull through. The team grieved, but each of them were forced to do so on their own. There was no room for an elite special forces group like Ares to go through a loss together, not when it would threaten to weaken them. So all alone, they mourned Cipher. 6 pillars of solitude. Ultimately, the seed vault was retaken, and none of the polonium cache had made it into the outside world, besides the molecules inside of Raptor. Umbral gained the dead of whatever rival corporation had sent in armor, and all the time in the world to dissect the corpses and learn their secrets. Ares benefited, at least a little. The incredibly sharp blades that armor had been carrying turned out to be monomolecular technology, with edges sharpened down to such a small degree that they could slice at nearly the molecular level. Umbral allowed a single one to be carried by the close-quarter combat specialists in a few exclusive Eclipse Initiative teams, which meant that Tempest received a blade. Hawkeye was the other Ares member that was given a boon from the Svalbard mission. While he still felt like shit about what had happened back in the vaults, he accepted the gift of the optical camouflage readily. Umbral's scientists had managed to switch the passive energy field power source to an individually carried source, so the sniper could use it anywhere he pleased. Hawkeye was almost invisible when he was posted up anyway, but now he would be almost unstoppable. It wasn't long until he got to try it in either. Ares' sniper was called upon to sub in for a sniper on a different Eclipse Initiative team, only a few days after the Svalbard mission. The other team's sniper had been injured in combat hours before the team was to be deployed. It was a simple mission, since the team was less experienced than Ares by a stretch. Hawkeye posted on the edge of a cliff, invisible, while his temporary team infiltrated a small South American village below. He rested on his stomach, silent, and watched through his scope as the mission progressed. It was easy work. His mind wandered to uncomfortable places. Sweating beneath his uniform, Hawkeye blinked. Each time he did, behind his closed eyes, he saw flashes of that frozen night beneath the mountain. His own hand picking up the discarded armor pistol. Waiting. Just breathing. While Cipher shut down the ventilation system and let the team know they were good to proceed. The lightning-quick movement of wrenching Cipher's helmet and attached comms off his head and snaking his arm around his squadmate's neck. Cipher's hands digging at his arm, the fair skin of his face going cyanotic. Breathing. Fuck. Ivan, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry. It was the longest sentence he had ever said to the kid. Then, lowering the unconscious body to the ground and sinking the single shot into the back of his head. Slightly messy and off-center to look like a wild shot from the ground. It wasn't the only friendly fire kill he had made for Umbral, but it might have been the hardest. But he had his orders. Hawkeye had his job. The sniper breathed steady, hot wind blowing over him. Like always, he waited. Sometimes Ivan still dreamt of Siberia, and how the horrible, dreadful vastness of it seemed to stretch out forever. He remembered how it felt impossible to escape that place, how a mechanic's son in a nearly empty mining town might be born and die in the same hospital, decades apart, without ever tasting the salt of the sea, or standing in the beating heart center of an actual city. Sometimes he dreamt of his mother, pale and blonde, speaking his real, full name, and promising him he was destined for more than that place. For more than the permafrost earth, Serbian nights, and blue-green ribbons on the horizon, and a cold so fierce that it burned when he breathed in. No matter what he dreamt, though, he still woke up in his efficiency apartment provided by Umbral, in a bed that was too soft for his back, brewing coffee so strong a black that it actually made him feel alive for a few minutes at a time. Ivan had become something more than the mechanic's son, but to him it felt like he had traded one prison for another. But at least the one he was in was of his own choosing. Sort of. He discovered his talent for working with electronics when he was just 12. The school he attended managed to bring in some prehistoric-looking laptops, and while the other kids spent their time hunting and pecking on the keyboards and gawking at the screens, Ivan seemed to pour himself into the old machine. He became a part of it, and within days knew it better inside and out than he knew his own body. It was wondrous, a miracle to the boy. At first he had gotten detention for tearing the things apart and putting them back together better and faster. But soon enough, one of his teachers reported his prowess to someone in the government sphere. Within days, Ivan's parents were getting calls telling them that their son had earned a scholarship to attend a prestigious private school in Moscow. It would come with a job already waiting for him when he finished school 8 years later, earning more yearly than his father had in his entire life. The only catch? He'd be working for the Russian military when he graduated. If he did well enough, they wouldn't force him through the same physical training as the other soldiers. But he was still going to be indebted to the government for a good portion of his life if they took the opportunity. Despite that, all his parents saw was a chance for a better life for their only son. What was the problem with a government job anyway? Sure, megacorporations ruled the world, and individual government entities were a shadow of what they had once been. But the Kozlovs didn't know that. They didn't even have internet access. So, Ivan's parents had kissed his wind-chapped cheeks and loaded him onto a train, destined for a better life, or so they thought. His scholarship wasn't a lie, really. They kept their word for the most part, but only in the most basic sense. He went to that prestigious school, got to live in the comfortable, warm dormitories with other boys his age, but that wasn't all. Ivan only went to class half the day. The other half, he spent training. Sat in front of a computer for hours on end, Ivan was trained to breach any network, take down any mainframe. Then they would have him studying the hardware of it all, using his hands and not his mind to tear things apart and examine the wiry guts. He learned these things alongside a few other kids his age, but there were also full-grown soldiers too. It was the latter group that became resentful as Ivan shot to the top of all the classes, outshining even the professors assigned to him. Ivan Kozlov was brilliant, a bright and shining thing, shackled to a failing government for the foreseeable future. The years passed, and Ivan's shackles started to chafe. At first, it made him feel terrible. Was he being ungrateful? Wasn't this what he wanted? To be more than the sum of all his parts? But the boy missed his parents even if he didn't miss his home. And he missed the never-ending reach of the dreams he once allowed himself to have. Now, he knew what he would be when he was an adult, without a doubt. A tool, even if he was a shiny one. At 17, Ivan had learned everything he could, and more. He had surged past all the Russian government could teach him, and was learning everything else independently. They started having him back up already active agents in cyber attacks. And he was shocked at how shallow and boring it all was. Move money here, steal intel there. Was that all he would ever be destined for? Where was the excitement? The groundbreaking, heart-pounding work he had imagined? That's when he saw his escape route. During one job he was assisting with, unpaid of course, Ivan and the rest of the team ran into something that none of them had ever seen before. An endless, almost impenetrable firewall, more complex and convoluted than any of them could imagine. "What the hell is this?" Ivan asked, looking at the older man next to him that was running lead on the digital attack. "An automatic failure for us. That's what it is," he spit back, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. "Volga." There were numerous megacorporations that all but ruled the world, and the biggest one in Russia was the Volga firm. It was a shock to his system to hear that Volga's technology was light years ahead of the government's. They had equipment and inventions that he had never even heard of before, and their agents were free to do as they pleased, morals be damned, as long as they got results. In that moment, Ivan knew Volga was his way out of the contract his parents had signed. All he had to do was prove himself an asset worth acquiring, and he was sure Volga would do anything to gain a man like Ivan. But he also knew that he only had one chance, because once he made his move, the Russian government would castigate him if Volga didn't decide to pull him out. Volga wouldn't want anything from the government. They were above that, and probably already had access to everything the government knew. So what did they want? What could he provide them that would make him stand out? One megacorporation clung to the title as leader of the pack, and had done so for years, and it wasn't Volga. The Umbral Group, based out of the United States, was the corporation to beat. So, Ivan thought, if he could breach Umbral's cybersecurity system and steal even a little morsel of information, he could offer it to Volga and barter it for his freedom. He waited until night had fallen and took his private laptop down to the computer lab. Ivan worked in the dark, face lit up by the anemic blue light of his screen, and began the most arduous task of his entire life. The young man started at 11 p.m. He didn't crack the surface of Umbral's servers until 3:20 a.m., sweat pouring down his face from stress. Alarms were going off at Umbral's HQ. He was sure of it. Going in soft and quiet had been impossible. So Ivan had to brute force his way in, stealing a short list of private contacts before fleeing the server and shutting the proverbial door behind him. As quickly as he could, he opened the contact list, planning to send it to Volga straight away and demand they pull him from the school as soon as he could. Except when he opened the file, which should have contained 10 names with contact information attached. There was just one name, over and over again, along with a bone-chilling message attached to the end.
Ivan Kozlov, we see you.
It read 10 times over. Shaking, he slammed the laptop shut and felt tears pressing against the back of his eyeballs as his panic built and built. Ivan didn't sleep that night. He laid in his dormitory bed and stared at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise and his fate to make itself known. School security came at 7 a.m., and Ivan stood without them even saying a word to indicate who they needed. He walked between the two guards, fists clenched to hide how hard he was quivering. The terror was so strong it made him nauseous. In the office of the school's director, Ivan pulled at the sleeves of his uniform and waited. The middle-aged man behind the desk was a different one than when he first arrived all those years ago. He looked exhausted, and he held Ivan's gaze for long minutes before sighing heavily. "You have two options, Mr. Kozlov. Expulsion and potentially extradition to be tried for cyber theft in the United States. Or you can leave now. We'll mark you as graduated and Umbral agents will immediately pick you up." The second sentence had his head spinning. "I don't understand." "We wanted 10 years of your time once you were done here, you foolish young man. They want your secrecy and your obedience for the rest of your life." With that said, the director turned his computer monitor around so Ivan could see it, and there was a man he had never seen before on a video call. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, hair combed back from his eyes, and expensive glasses perched on his nose. There was a knowing smirk on his face. "Mr. Kozlov, I'm here on behalf of the Umbral Group, and more specifically, their covert operations sector, the Eclipse Initiative. We are both upset and impressed at what you could accomplish on your own last night. But we can't let you get away with such a crime. We will make it simple for you to atone for your sins, though, if you're willing." "I stole nothing," Ivan insisted. "It was just a document with my name on it, over and over." Yes, but it was the intention that matters. Don't you agree?" The man on the screen leaned forward and steepled his fingers together. "So, here's my offer to you. I can send a flight for you, and you'll be at headquarters by evening, undergoing the initiation process. And once your training is done, you'll have access to world-class, cutting-edge technology, and the chance to be challenged. New jobs, new equipment, new locations, all the time." "And what's the catch, exactly?" The man chuckled. You'll belong to us, Mr. Kozlov. And if you try to pull something like you did last night, it will be not just your life that is forfeit, but your family's life as well. Loyalty is the most important attribute that we require in our employees. What do you say? There was no question. Ivan had aimed to be recruited by Volga, but caught the eye of Umbral instead. For better or for worse. The image of his mother, her sweet, pale face smiling when she hugged him during the last holiday he visited home, flashed through his mind's eye. It was a risk, but he had to know. Will I be paid? When the director gasped at the audacity, and the man from Umbral raised his eyebrows, Ivan quickly added, Only so I could support my parents. Umbral's ambassador sighed. Yes, once your training is complete, you will receive a handsome stipend. Now you're testing my patience. What is your answer? Ivan gave up trying to hide his excitement, letting it flow through him freely. Yes, I accept. I'll start packing. Good. We look forward to seeing you soon, Mr. Kozlov. Umbral broke him down to pieces, to the very atoms of himself. They took his body and ran it into the ground until he came back stronger, faster. At a rate that should have been impossible, they filled his mind with more and more information until he was sure it could hold no more. But then it did. Ivan learned to fight, to shoot, and how to let his identity fall away until he was just a lump of clay, a blank slate, ready to be added to any team within the Eclipse Initiative. Then finally, they took his name. The day he joined the Advanced Recon and Extraction Squad, known as Ares, he stopped being Ivan and became Cipher. It was his code name, but it was more than that. It was the badge that said he was an elite soldier, one of Umbral's top electronic warfare specialists. He always knew, in the back of his mind, that he had sold himself and all his talents to Umbral. Cipher should have been the obedient agent that he promised. But even after he had been destroyed and reforged, there was that little spark inside of him. The spark of curiosity. And while he lived for the moments when brand new technology was put into his hands, Cipher was bitter that he was dropped into the field with his team, repeatedly, with little to no information. So, he skimmed off the top, just enough information so that he knew what his team's missions involved. It wasn't until the Chimera incident that he ever went below the surface level, and he regretted it immediately. What he found terrified him, and it made him off his game for the entire mission. But like a drug, he kept going back. The things that Umbral was involved in were so surreal that he couldn't stop. Cipher was addicted. Which was why, when he and the rest of Ares was dropped into the frigid Svalbard night, Cipher already knew what monstrous thing was hiding deep in the sandstone mountain. It was why Hawkeye, his friend, his squad mate, a man that was supposed to be a brother to him, a man he trusted, wrapped his arms around Cipher's neck, pressed the barrel of a pistol to the base of his skull. Cipher knew too much, and that was not acceptable. But at least, when they were first dropped, when the chopper left, he snatched one look at the northern lights in the sky and felt the chill on his face that reminded him for a moment of those empty, Siberian expanses of his childhood. A few hours before he died, Cipher closed his eyes, breathed in until it burned from the cold. And for those few precious, shivering seconds, he was home.